America's goal is dominance, stated clearly. So if another country is rising or powerful or a pure competitor, that's per se bad. Now, as an economist, this is completely against everything I was trained and I've thought about for my entire career, which is that economic well-being is not a zero-sum struggle. So if one part of the world is better off, that doesn't diminish the rest of the world. In fact, the most formative document of economic ideas of the modern world, which will celebrate its 250th anniversary next year, is Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. It's actually a very good book, by the way. It's got a couple of flaws which we could mention in discussion, but it's a book of pure genius and humanism also. But his basic idea is the world helps each other. Different parts of the world trade with each other. This is mutually beneficial, not the American mindset. Mutually beneficial. And so a larger world market is good for everybody. And Smith had two very humane insights. One, he told the British, because he was writing, of course, in Scotland in 1776, don't fight with the Americans. Trade with them. Let them be independent. We don't need colonies. We just need free trade because that's what makes us better off. So that was one very humane idea, which, of course, King George III did not listen to. So there was a revolutionary war that lasted for many, many years. Incidentally, the war was actually won not by George Washington, it was won by the French, who saw an opportunity to undermine their rival, Britain. Again, a very European idea, that we can hurt Britain by helping the United States. France did such a good job that they spent so much money, they went so deeply into debt that they had a revolution the next decade when their finance minister tried to raise taxes to pay off the debts that had been incurred in fighting the British in North America. But that's another story. But the point is that Smith said, let them go. We just need to trade with them. We don't need to dominate them. And the other thing that Adam Smith said quite wonderfully and very relevant for us is that he said, it's my favorite paragraphs in economics, by the way, which you can find in the middle of the Wealth of Nations. He says that the two most significant events in the history of mankind are the voyages of Columbus, or he says the discovery of the sea routes to the Americas and to Asia from Europe. So the voyages of Christopher Columbus in 1492 and of Vasco da Gama in 1498. And he says, in a very humane way again, these events united the whole world. And in fact, united the world for the first time of 10,000 years, because 10,000 years ago, the world was united over a land bridge between Asia and the Americas, which went underwater when the Ice Age ended and the sea level rose. So Beringia became the Bering Straits rather than a land bridge. And so the world was divided between the old world and the new world, and then came these voyages. And Smith says this should have benefited everybody because each part of the world could help to meet the needs of other parts of the world, so we should have mutual benefit. And then he says, but it happened that European military superiority was so vast that these meetings of the different parts of the world rendered devastation on the East and West Indies, the natives of the East and West Indies, he writes in 1776. And then he says, but someday there will be a rebalancing of power in the world. And that will come about through trade, because trade will spread ideas and allow the regions that are now under the domination of European rule to to rise in power and reestablish an international justice based on an equality of force. American demography has changed decisively. We were about 88% white and almost entirely European in 1950. Now the United States is, by the US Census definition, white means white non-Hispanic. So all of this place knows more about race than any place on the whole planet, and classifications and all the weirdness and so on. But in the US, white means that you're not Hispanic, or people of color of various sorts, from African American, Asian American, and so on. And that white non-Hispanic category, which was about 88% of the population, is now 55% of the population. And it will be less than 50% by the 2040s. So Trump is the last reactionary response to that. He is literally created by Obama's presidency, because he is the reaction to Obama. And Mamdani is the reaction to Trump. And by the way, Mamdani and Obama are the future of the country, just in a pure demographic sense. And so Trump is not the end of the story, but he is the weirdest part of the story we ever had. That's absolutely for sure. So where we are geopolitically is that the world is rebalancing, but especially what has happened is Asia's rise. And Asia has many different parts to it, and it's very interesting to attend to the different parts of Asia. And I won't do a long excursus about this, except to say that it's such a fascinating story because, of course, Asia is about 60% of the world population, so it's a lot of human history. But when European imperialism dominated Africa and Asia in the 19th century, one country in Asia escaped colonial rule in either a direct or indirect way. It nearly fell under colonial rule, but escaped it, and that was Japan. And it's a fascinating story, but Japan reacted to the arrival of American imperialism, actually, with the U.S. Navy showing up in Tokyo Bay in the 1850s by having a decisive, I call it a capitalist revolution, in 1868 called the Meiji Restoration. And they said, we got to get our act together, otherwise we're going to fall under the sway of these Western barbarians. And they did get their act together in the most remarkable way. And one of the things they did, which is one of my favorite stories of economic history, is they didn't have the internet then, connectivity was weak. So they established a commission in 1868 to tour the world to find out what were the best practices of the most powerful countries, called the Iwakura Commission. And it went off to the world and came back with 18 volumes of observations about Europe and the United States and what to do. And they made radical reforms in the early 1870s, and that propelled the first industrialization of Asia. And they got so good at it that by 1895, they became an imperial power. So it was something in the mindset. It's actually also an incredible story. In 1894, Japan invaded China, and a Chinese diplomat said to his Japanese counterpart, "Why are you invading us? We're being attacked by the barbarians from the West, and you're attacking us." And the Japanese diplomat responded, "Oh, sorry, we have joined their club." That's a literal quotation from a wonderful book by Ezra Vogel about China and Japan facing history. And the Japanese became Western imperialists, wannabes, and invaded China repeatedly up until 1945 and colonized Taiwan and Korea and so forth. Anyway, back to our current events. This Asia dynamism started with Japan. Japan then became the imperial power of East Asia. It launched World War II in Asia, of course. They were absolutely brutal, by the way, stunningly brutal, with 10 to 20 million Chinese dying during World War II, a story very few people know, and I certainly did not know in detail until reading a wonderful book this year by a Harvard professor named Rana Mitter called The Forgotten Ally, about what happened to China during World War II and how completely devastating that war was. But in any event, after World War II, Japan almost immediately recovered within a 15-year period because the United States rebuilt Japan with a lot of Japanese effort, of course, but rebuilt Japan to be a bulwark against communism in East Asia. So the U.S. gave an extra hand. So that started the Asian recovery after World War II. Then came all the countries that followed Japan's example, how to grow rapidly, because Japan invented a rapid growth strategy, first in the 1870s, and then they did it again after World War II. And it's a mix of state and market. It is state-guided market growth. And if it sounds familiar in China, it's because China learned it from Japan. Actually, China learned it truly from Singapore, which had learned it from Japan. So first came Japanese growth, then came the so-called Asian tigers, Taiwan, Korea, Singapore, and Hong Kong. Then Deng Xiaoping came to power in China in 1978, had a long conversation with Lee Kuan Yew when he visited Singapore, and implemented the Singapore model, I would say, which was the Japanese model, and implemented it so well that 1.4 billion people became a high-income, technologically dynamic rival of the United States within a 40-year period.